Right, Elmer, I appreciate you taking time out of a busy schedule to discuss with me, and I want to talk about religion and sociology, your particular discipline. And as always, I have a slant on that. I want to talk about the role of religion as functioning either in a constructive way or in a destructive one. And so let's begin to address that kind of question just out of a common sense sort of approach to it. There's a lot of people who say that religion was negative for me. It gave me guilt feelings. It kept me from growing. I received all this negative training from my parents, moralism in the schools. A priest yelled at me when I went to confession. The nuns were difficult to deal with. And I ended up being stunted or somehow truncated in my growth because of religion. Now, this is a common way of talking about it that says religion is not a positive thing at all, but it's negative. And we could then take that common sense analysis and say there's been great sociologists who have claimed that same sort of thing. So let's look a little bit at that destructive side here and see what we're going to say about it.
Right. I think that's really a good point, Jim. If you did some projective testing and in terms of sentence completion or association with the person in the street, and you say, what do you think of when you hear the term religion? What sentiments, ideas does it elicit? That indeed the experiences that you gave would be very, very common. And then on the academic side with scholars and so on, they would do it more in terms of the macro level, societal level of different types of intolerance, oppression, of modernism, or of Ferdinand and Isabella, 1492, which is very timely with us now, and Columbus and the native peoples, and so on. But whether you took it at the academic level and in terms of intolerance, doctrinaire responses, oppression, triumphalism, the Crusades, or the man in the street, the person in the street, as you just said, there would be that negative pattern there. How dense it would be, how prevalent, I can't say, but I think one thing we could say, it does show the potency of religion, the strength of it, that it could have these types of consequences that are so enduring.
Right. Right, and as I want to bring out eventually, it really is ambivalent. There are destructive tendencies, but also constructive ones, and we in the religious world have to play up those positive ones. But I want to stay with the destructive tendencies and link it up with the intellectual tradition, because in the 19th and 20th century we have a whole tradition of outstanding thinkers who have been negative on religion and seen it fundamentally as dehumanizing or infantile. And we can go all the way back to Hegel at the beginning of the 19th century, who was sort of a father of a lot of modern philosophical thought. And Hegel says that, well, it's alienating. And that was his notion, that religion as we know it, the traditional Jewish Christian religions as we know it, is estranging precisely because of its fundamental tenets. That is, you are related to a transcendent God, and you are in a really subservient position in relationship to that God, and therefore it's easy for you to project that same attitude towards all your other relationships. Now, the common one we talk about today is, if God is patriarchal, if God is male and he's dominating, then husbands should dominate their wives, or as we read in Paul, wives should be subject to their husbands. So you get a dominating pattern based on the scriptural evidence, or the traditional way the Judeo-Christian tradition has played itself out. That's an example of the philosopher Hegel would end up looking at the negative side of religion. God is too transcendent. Of course, he had an answer to that. You make God more immanent, and bring God is the absolute spirit into the process itself. And we're living out that process. He had a way to change it. It gets to be a little tricky the way he did it. But I want to stay on his negative critique, because it's the same one that Marx picked up. Marx got it from Hegel, turned it around a bit, but it's the same fundamental idea. Religion is an opiate,
right,
and functions negatively.
Right. And, of course, then Marx became more associated with this position than did Hegel.
Yes.
And now we see analogous opiates of the people, such as sports and consumerism and so on. I guess what I might say here, in addition to the point that the fact that something can have such strong consequences indicates that it must be a potent force to start with. The other thing I would say is that in any area of life, the more intimate, the more profound, the more fundamental the interaction, the more potential you have there for damage, spiritual and psychological damage. So as we have damage in the pastoral sphere, we have damage in the pedagogic sphere. Virtually anybody can tell you horror stories about English teachers, mathematics teachers, physics and chemistry, and so on. Similarly, with parents or intimate family members, uncles, big brothers and big sisters who were oppressive, who abused, and so on. So here we have three other areas of life: family, pedagogy, religion, and maybe in some other areas, say in the coaching area with youth on the playing field, somebody who had rendered you impotent in your athletic aspirations, and so on. So I guess when we're playing with fire, although it can heat the home, can purify gold, it can also destroy the body. So religion is, as E.E. Cummings said about love, be of love more careful than anything else.
Because of its great power. Its potency, yes. Elmer, out of your tradition, there's a book by Karl Mannheim called Ideology and Utopia, which I think sets out this whole thing we're talking about. And we can stay with the ideology side of it. That becomes the sort of technical term from your discipline that we drink in the theological world. And ideology is something that's used to buttress the status quo, a rationalization that we use to keep things the way they are. So to go back to the example I used before, if you like the patriarchal society and you are a male and you're in a dominant position, then you could easily say, this is how God wanted it. We did that with slavery, as a matter of fact, as we know. I mean, the Christian preaching was that you were a slave, stay a slave, and these people were meant to be masters, and so God ordained it this way, so don't mess with it. Just accept the status quo. So an ideology keeps in place destructive systems. It offers no critique of injustice as it's found in the institutional realm. So I believe that notion of ideology here becomes important in understanding how religion can go badly. It's not just that the person is saying, I had this teacher who told me I was no good and that God would send me to hell, and therefore I'm deformed psychologically. It's much broader than that, and the world of sociology brings it into the macro level. It brings it in institutional level, where you're going to have a whole structure that says this. So what does it say to young women growing up in the Catholic Church that they can't be priests? It was just by going to Mass. You don't have to have anybody who hurt you or yelled at you or did anything else to you. You grow up in a society, a church society, that says, well, women can't become priests. Therefore, we are somehow we are second class in this organization. That's the way it functions institutionally. That is an ideology, I would say, when you combine it with a rationalization of this behavior.
That's right. So, or even more earlier in your life cycle, altar boy, which seems to be a marginal type thing, but for somebody at 10 or 12 years old, it could be quite profound. So you have then here institutional structures that can become oppressive, such as the magisterium, such as certain hierarchy in Rome, who have an apparatus in place, who not consciously and deliberately and in Machiavellian ways contrive defenses, justifications, rationalization, but rather as part of the Weltanschauung of the system in which they think and reason and have been raised in, they see certain existing arrangements as natural, as ordained by God, as ordained by nature, and irrevocable. You see, so it becomes self-perpetuating and irreversible, just like it does in South Africa or in other secular spheres. And with respect to the slavery one you mentioned, another example is that Aristotle, 350 years before Christ, who is known as the philosopher, even with that type of virtuosity, made a catastrophic boo-boo of looking about at the slaves there who supported the leisure society in ancient Athens and said, look, isn't it remarkable how inferior those slaves are in refinement and elegance and culture and learning? It is obvious that nature predisposed them to be slaves and that the existing system is just, fair, and reasonable.
So Aristotle needed a sociologist to dialogue with to point out how the structural factors, the cultural arrangements, societal orientations have influenced this, that have shaped the people that are found in that system. And so he needed a dialogue with sociology. And I must say, you could take that all the way to the 20th century, where theologians generally would have thought, not in that particular example, but done the same sort of thinking in relationship to the church, of failing to see the power of the institutional elements. Elmer, I thought you said that particularly well when you said that the people in the Vatican, for example, did not have bad will. I mean, it's not like they're looking for these terrible things to do to people. They simply assume that this is the system, that this is the way it works, and their language ends up supporting it, and their argumentation flows out of it, and so it's all an integrated whole. And I don't think any of those people running the church would, think of themselves as deliberately putting down women, or
right,
deliberately making life difficult for liberation theologians or something. It's
right,
just assumed that there's a right way of functioning, and these people aren't functioning right.
Sure. It's the social construction of reality. We fabricate our own reality according to certain traditions and customs and image and likeness of the past and so on. So sometimes we're able to break out of it through contacts and travel, like you said earlier, and I'm reminded of Gandhi. Who was once asked what he thought of Western civilization. And in very gentle, soft manner, he said, I think it would be a good idea. You see? So with us, Western civilization, that term conjures up the idea of the arts, science, literature, poetry, the dance, ballet, opera, and so on.
And whereas, in the mind of much of the world, it was seen, in colonialist terms,
right,
in domination terms.
Oppression and triumphalism of one type or another. And then finally, also with Gandhi, he once said that he thought that the Sermon on the Mount was the most sublime of all teachings in human history. So somebody asked him then whether he would think maybe becoming a Christian himself, and he said, I would become a Christian when the Christians become Christian. Yeah. You see? So that's another, the hypocrisy and so on. But in any event, the idea of Western civilization, something that we see as a positive force, we even had concepts you will recall, manifest destiny. It is the obvious self-evident responsibility of Western nations to go and colonize these countries in the third world. And not only that, it's the white man's burden. It's on our shoulders. We must carry that out. It is our duty, our divine right.
Our language is very revealing that way, isn't it? And then it had, of course, always the religious justification. Right. I mean, the Spanish were sending out missionaries and establishing, and they were going to Christianize these people. We forced them to become Christians because that's what we need to do with them.
Cross and crown.
You have to go together. And much of the treatment of the American Indians in the United States was along that same line. I mean, there was an ambivalence about it. These were barbarians, and really couldn't do anything with them. On the other hand, they were potential converts.
Right.
That was the only two ways of seeing them.
And now this year, 1992, 500 years later. It's the anniversary of the beginning of the colonial era. And so from the North Pole with the Inuits to the Terra del Fuego down south, of all of the Americas, we have the so-called indigenous people who are responding to that and saying, hey, it can be viewed otherwise.
Right. And it's sort of shocking to hear that from their viewpoint, and I think we need to hear that periodically because it shakes up our ordinary perceptions. Elmer, I want to move now. What we've tried to say to this point is that there can be a destructive side to religion. You've made the point that it's pervasive and powerful. It works through structures and institutions, but now we can't leave the final word, at least I as a theologian can't leave the final word to Karl Marx on this whole thing, because Mannheim wrote a book in the other part of Ideology and Utopia. And the other side of his understanding is that religion functions in a positive way. And I want to begin to look at that because in one way it does is the claim is that it is not dehumanizing, but it's liberating, that it's growth producing, that it produces more mature people. Now there's a common sense argument on that, apart from what the scholars say, is just to look around. Some people who are religious are really good. They make a difference. They're attractive people. They work well in our world. We could think of some great ones, I suppose, like Mother Teresa. Religion, I don't think most people wouldn't say religion has made Mother Teresa infantile or dehumanized her. It's given her an expanded sense of humanity. It's enabled her to reach out to those who are unloved and unwanted, the streets of Calcutta, the poorest of all the people in the world, and so on. So that I think just by common sense and looking historically, you can look at individuals and say, well, Marx can't have the final word or an absolute total word because you've got people who are very fully developed as humans precisely because they've been religious.
Yes, I think that's a good point, Jim. And here we might be entering what people call the prophetic role of religion. Both theologians and sociologists use that concept. So here the idea is the capacity to envision alternative arrangements that would be more ideal, more humane, more compatible with human growth and aspiration. Even on a more secular level, I'm thinking of E.F. Schumacher's beautiful little book written from a Catholic point of view, Small is Beautiful. And the subtitle of it is very interesting. Economics as if people mattered.
Yeah, it reminds me of the bishop's pastoral on the economy, where they said economic systems must be set up so that they benefit people. That's the whole thing. The system doesn't exist, just for its own, on its own momentum and so on. Does it benefit people? Is it good for people to help them to grow?
So now we see then the role of the prophet here for at least 6,000 years of of civilization. We can see in the Hebrew Scriptures the wonderful actions of the prophets who were physically even trying to liberate the people from their chains, from their enslavement, from the Babylonians, from the Egyptians, and so on, and also from their own bad habits, their own retrograde practices of hankering after flesh pots, of going back to enslavement when he's trying to lead them into freedom, which on the other hand is conducive to anxiety. And okay, so...
But you don't want to miss that. You're a very important point, the role of the prophet. In other words, part of the sociological analysis is to distinguish prophet from priest and take the priest who seems to be part of the status quo and often working for the king and a yes man and all of that. It's a bad word. I mean, being a priest, I'm not, don't like to tag negative connotations on that word, but the way the sociologists distinguish it, the priest really is an establishment figure who buttresses the status quo and won't speak up in favor of some sort of liberating change. Now you're playing that off against the prophets and looking at concrete examples of people like Amos and Osee and Ezekiel and Isaiah and Jeremiah, and maybe especially Jeremiah, who challenges the status quo, challenges the power establishment, and says, no, there's a higher fidelity. It's the fidelity to the covenant made with Yahweh.
And without a vision, the people perish. And then as you move through time, then you see various reformers who take on a prophetic role, such as Francis, such as Benedict, Luther, and other reformers, and then on up through more modern times, people like Gandhi, once again, freed the whole continent of India, evolved the practice of nonviolence, so powerful, and then passed through to Martin Luther King, and then now currently, say, with Berrigan, who and other people of the plowshare demonstrations, swords into plowshares against nuclear weapons, and so on, all functioning in the prophetic role, saying, hey, there are alternative ways of viewing this. We are calling you to a higher aspiration. This is not the way it should be.
Let's take up Mannheim's notion of utopia and how it functions. Now, there is a dreamlike approach to reality, I think, that is negative and destructive. That is, people have somebody's living in the ghetto and they think they're going to be Michael Jordan and get out that way. Or there's some young people watching cartoons on Saturdays and going through school never facing reality and thinking that life will be beautiful without any real effort. So there's a kind of utopian thinking that we associate with negativity. Your utopian means you're out of touch with reality. You don't know what's going on, man, and you'll never function in the real world.
Yeah, that's more a fantasy, I think.
Yeah, Jim. Different word. But in Mannheim's use of utopia is positive. That is, utopia is like a dream that challenges the status quo, but also gives you a sense that you could move in that direction. It's a vision that says, yes, it's possible to make progress towards that. My image
Even
of this...
though the word itself means nowhere in Greek.
Right.
But it is an ideal type against which we can hold and compare existing arrangements.
Right, and I think that almost all sociologists have had some sort of utopian model in their mind when they criticize society. Because if you're going to criticize something, you've got to have some sense of how it ought to be better. It's at least presumed. What we'd like to do is to tease that out and say, well, what does this look like? Now, the great utopian dream for Christians, of course, was given to us by Jesus. It's in the notion of the reign of God, the kingdom of heaven. It's a situation in which there is communal life, in which there's peace and justice, shalom, as our Jewish friends say, righteousness, all the good and beautiful things. And then you look at the world and you look at the church itself and you say it doesn't stack up to that.
There's a gap.
Yeah, a gap, and the gap should move us to function more effectively to try to close the gap. It should motivate us.
The gap should be reduced over time, one would think.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's how the utopia should function, and I think that was Mannheim's idea. I got this image, Elmer, something like this, that if we're here in this reality, out front of us is like this magnet. Now, if the magnet's too far out front, it won't draw us. If it's too unrealistic, like I'm going to make this parish perfect and we're all going to be perfect tomorrow and there's going to be no more strife, no more racism, sexism, it's not going to work. But if you can get the magnet closer to the reality and people can look at it and say, well, we could do a little bit better here. You know, we could have get along better between the races in this country, and here's how we could go about it. Then you can mobilize, galvanize people into action. I think Martin Luther King precisely had that power. He could talk about the dream, the utopian situation, in such a way that when he finished, you'd say, let's go do something about it.
Right. Right. So you might think of it in terms of, I think the magnet is a good metaphor there, that the electrons cannot pass through. You won't have any conduit if they're too distant. So that's good. So it has to have a touch of reality. And I'm reminded of the old saying that the role of the pastor is to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comforted, to afflict the comfortable.
Yeah.
And I think that perhaps many people would think that we have had too much emphasis on the one side of comforting people and not afflicting them with injustice and with situations out there that should not exist, that should be changed, you see. And then religion becomes the opiate of the singing, of the reverie, of the fantasy, of the bubble world.
Maybe you could say it this way, that the current priests should become more prophetic in their role.
Yes.
You know, we need a greater prophetic role among church leaders, and I didn't mean to reduce that to priests, but all the pastoral leaders need to have a more prophetic stance. That is, they have to have a vision without which we perish, as you said before, without that vision, biblical reference, and without that, we don't know where we're going. So we have to have some vision that will galvanize us and say, let's start to work towards it. And
right.
that religion ought to provide that. And,
right.
and Christianity, I think, does, and I think Judaism does as well, and Islam, all the religions of the book, have some sort of vision of how society ought to run.
Now, I think that as you move up the social ladder of education and denominations linked with education, I think there is even more of a danger of getting into the comforting, of the psychologizing, I'm okay, you're okay, bad things don't last forever, and so on. And if you listen to TV evangelists and some of the California-style New Age religions and so on, and the big growth ones, and EST, these religious surrogates and so on, that they are a type of self-esteem boosting and so on, and that individualizing one-on-one, and this prophetic is very absent.
Yes, and to the detriment, I think.
To the detriment.
For sure. Yeah.
Right. And so what it does is it, I think, roots out the social responsibility, the concept of evil structures, of social sin, of racism, and things like that, and individualizes it, psychologizes it, get your act together, gird your loins, be responsible, work hard, and so on.
Yeah, and I think that, again, to go back to our dominant focus here, which is religion and sociology, the sociologists help us to keep it in a broader context. I think that's exactly what ends up happening. So, Elmer, what we've done, I think, is look at the fact that religion functions two ways, positively and negatively. The sociological tradition has pointed out how it functions negatively by dehumanizing, by alienating, as Hegel said, but I want to be on the other side of it and say, yes, but it does good things as well, and it can free people up, and we see them walking around every day, and it can provide us with a great dream, a vision. We see Christ as the one with a great vision of how life ought to be lived. You look at that and you'd say, why not? Why can't we take some steps in that direction?